I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Iqra Aftab. She is a rheumatologist with a unique perspective on patient care. She treats patients with autoimmune and inflammatory disorders like lupus and arthritis, often not able to cure their condition. But in her practice, she places a strong emphasis on healing while acknowledging that patients may be confused or frightened about their diagnosis. She says the best part of her job is getting to know her patients long term, sharing their joys and sorrows, their highs and lows, and being there to make a positive impact in their life. She has studied around the world, speaks 4 languages, and has authored or contributed to the publication of many papers, presentations, and even a medical textbook. Despite her busy schedule, she remains an active volunteer in soup kitchens, orphanages, and as a student leader, tutor, peer coach, and research assistant. She also has represented the medical community before members of Congress. She's with us today to talk specifically about her experience working with patients and the lack of diversity in medical textbooks. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aftab. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, NewYorkBIO, for having me here today. So I'm going to be talking, as Jennifer said, from a provider perspective. And can we have the next set of slides? There. Okay. And the title of my talk is called Humility and Hope, Lessons in Treating Autoimmune Disease. So before I begin, I want you guys to take a moment to just recall what life was like for you when you were in your early 20s. Were you finishing up school? Were you, finding your first job? Were you looking for your first new place? What were some of the milestones that you were excited to wake up to? But imagine if instead you started waking up with unusual symptoms. So fevers, rashes, swollen joints, low blood counts, and relentless fatigue. Imagine going from doctor to doctor to figure out what was going on with you. Imagine years passing by before somebody finally gave your illness a name. And then, after being diagnosed, imagine being told that irreversible organ damage had already occurred. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? But this is the unfortunate reality of a lot of patients that I see in my clinic. And every day I diagnose them with rare autoimmune illnesses like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, vasculitis, myositis, and that's just to name a few. On average, my patients will have seen about 4 doctors before finally being referred to me. At that point, their symptoms have been going on for roughly 4 years. So it's no surprise that irreversible organ damage has often already occurred. Other than being difficult to diagnose, what ties my patients together is that they're often in their early 20s and belong to ethnic minority groups. And data supports this finding. So a study from the CDC shows that lupus is 2 to 3 times more likely to affect Black and Hispanic women than white women. And then what complicates care on top of this is that a lot of my patients also belong to some of the poorest communities of New Jersey, and poverty has consistently been shown to be one of the most important predictors of mortality, and especially in patients with autoimmune diseases. So today I want to reflect on the experience of caring for these patients, the ones who are young, suffer with rare diseases, and belong to underserved communities. For starters, why does it take my patients so long to get diagnosed? Part of the problem is that not only are their symptoms vague, but there's also a lot of difference in disease presentation. So, for instance, in training, I was taught that Lyme's disease looks like this bright red target-appearing rash, and it does, but that's only on patients with lighter skin tones. On patients with darker skin tones, it's a much different story. The rash can appear a lot more spread out, and the color can be quite different. So it's almost this like brown, darker, violaceous purple. But this is not the representation you'll find in most textbooks. And this is a very small example of how disease presentation varies across ethnicities and can therefore be a diagnostic challenge. The other issue is that my patients are vastly underrepresented in clinical trials. So a study from the Stanford University showed that white patients make up only a third of lupus cases and yet make up about 51% of clinical trials. And meanwhile, Black patients make up nearly half of lupus cases and yet comprise only 14% of clinical trial participants. So you can imagine that when I'm dealing with this patient population here, the one that's only been represented 14% of the time in clinical trials, I'm often left wondering how they will respond to my medications. And, it really does take us a lot of trial and error to figure out the right medication option for them. And on days when we're struggling, I often tell my patients not to give up, although to be honest, there are days when I need that advice just as much as them. But our battle doesn't even end there. After we diagnose them and find them the right medication, getting them access to that medication is still a really big challenge. So on average, the medications that I prescribe cost anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000 a year, with some of the most expensive ones exceeding up to $500,000 per year. Let that number sink in. Now, insurance plans will go ahead and cover some of these expenses, but my patients are still left with a significant out-of-pocket cost. And even getting them that process of insurance approval is not an easy task. At the end of a long day, I'm often faced with stacks of insurance denials, and then I have to start something called a prior authorization. And for those of you who might not know, prior authorization is this extremely arduous process where my clinic staff and I pull together clinical data to build a case to present to insurance companies that tells them why the medication needs to be approved. Then we submit all of this data to insurance companies and we wait, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. And even at the end of all of that waiting, insurance companies might turn around and still reject that medication, and then we have to file for an appeal. So you can imagine that what this translates to for my patients is a delay in care. So at the end of the day, I'm incredibly humbled by how much progress we still need to make in terms of diagnosing and treating autoimmune diseases. On days when I feel disappointed in my ability to help as a doctor, I take a step back and imagine how frustrated my patients must feel, because all of my struggles represent only a fraction of theirs. But at the same time, I'm also incredibly hopeful. I think we're living in very exciting times where we're at this cusp of, a revolution in artificial intelligence, and I know that this will go ahead and transform the way we deliver care. So how can we incorporate AI when it comes to caring for our patients? For starters, we can use AI to assist with clinical decision-making. So part of the problem I mentioned earlier was that there's so much variation in disease presentation that oftentimes that leads to a delay in diagnosis and referral. So if we can get AI to step in there, because in extremely busy clinical practices, there's, again, so much disease heterogeneity that we can't expect doctors to be able to recognize at all. In addition, we can use AI-generated patient simulators. So, and this can help trainees understand how disease presentations vary across ethnicities, such as with the example of the rashes that I gave earlier. Similarly, we can use AI to boost patient enrollment in clinical trials. So we can use algorithms to pinpoint community centers where underserved patients are more likely to seek care. And researchers can also use AI to assess data from past trials to figure out which demographics for which diseases need to be better represented in the future. Last but not least, we have to use AI to make access to medication easier. For example, AI can automate a lot of the manual work that is needed in prior authorizations, and this can shorten approval time for our patients. We can also use AI to analyze data to identify existing drugs that can have therapeutic potential for other diseases. So if we can repurpose approved drugs for new indications, we can accelerate the drug discovery process and reduce drug development costs. So I'm very excited to see what the next chapter of healthcare will look like. To finish off, I want to reflect on what brought me here to speak on behalf of my patients today. I think it's because I see them struggle so much every day, in more ways than one. Not only do they belong to marginalized communities, but they also live with these rare, debilitating diseases. And I think of how much courage that must take on their part. I also think of how young they are and how they have their whole lives ahead of them. And that makes me want to improve the quality of their lives. I'm always cognizant of how privileged I am to be taking care of these patients, and I'm always dreaming of ways in which we can do it better. So I hope that in my work as a rheumatologist, I'm able to come up with new and meaningful ways that transform the way we care for these patients. And if any of you in the audience have ideas that I can help with, I'm happy to chat with you after. So on this very hopeful note, thank you for listening.